Everyone will just get over it. Well, we now have the most robust sanctions regime in history on the Russians. And it would be a lot worse for China because Russia is a massive exporter of food and energy. China is the world's biggest importer of both. But I think what has really terrified the Politburo are the boycotts. Because here you have private citizens and companies who, without prodding from their governments, have just walked away from, $500 billion of sunk cost. There is no Chinese economic system without international trade, foreign technology, and market access. And the idea that Halliburton has left Russia on moral grounds. There is no moral cover for anyone who wanted to stay in Russia. And the Chinese look at their system like, they were doing a genocide long before the Russians started. This is a country that isn't a democracy. This is a country that cracks down on protesters. This is a country with a horrible record of social management. There's a lot more places for Western ideology to kind of get their claws into if you really want to take it down. And they now know that the West is perfectly capable of doing it. One of the things we saw with the Russians, and when they tried to move away from the dollar and the euro, they went into whatever currency was available. And honestly, there weren't a lot left at that point. But they did put about $250 billion, if memory serves, into the yuan. And then when they tried to cash it in later, the Chinese were like, nope, we don't want that back. And so the Russians have been forced to move back into the euro and the dollar, just do it really quietly, because there just aren't a lot of options. And then, of course, they fly around a lot of gold. That's really their most reliable way of getting around sanctions. So there's not a lot of options. In the case of the Persian Gulf, there might be some room there, because the Saudis in particular, now that the United States is no longer their largest consumer and no longer their security guarantor, they've been looking for a new friend. The Chinese have come in with a lot of money and a lot of demand. And so the Saudis have done kind of a co-investment thing in industrial plant in China and refineries, just like they did in the United States. And having a yuan trade for that specific sales line, that makes a degree of sense. But keep in mind that if there is a conflict that involves China and the United States, no ships will be coming and going from China. So the Saudis know full well that if you are involved in a hot war with the United States, your tankers don't go there. And so there would be no point in a hot war scenario for the Saudis to do that. Yeah, in a hot war scenario, we are talking about the deindustrialization of the Chinese system and famine within a year, because this is a country that imports 75% of its energy and 75% of the inputs that allow it to grow its own food. If we do have a conflict over Taiwan that does involve either Japan, the United States, Vietnam, or India, because any one of them can do this, that is the end of China as a modern industrialized power with over 1 billion people.
First of all, China does not have many dealings in Africa. They have some infrastructure that they've built. Well, whenever you see the Chinese spending $12 billion on something that's only worth $3 or $4 billion, that's not investment, that's capital flight. That's some bureaucrat taking advantage of that hyper-financialized system to get some out. So when it's his time to run for the door, he already has a nest egg. They're splashing around a lot of cash. I agree. I'm just saying that it's not in anything that would broadly be considered sound investment. Most of the infrastructure is not in places that are really of any use. I mean, if the Chinese build infrastructure in a place that hasn't had infrastructure for the last 70 years, you really got to ask yourself why there has not been infrastructure there for the last now, they are investing in some resource production zones, absolutely, but again, they're overpaying for them. So the Chinese are doing no refining, and they're doing no manufacturing in Africa. So they're actually not taking the African labor force and bringing it up a notch at all. And if they want unskilled labor, they've got that closer to home in a place like, say, Cambodia. So for Africa to kind of move up the ladder, they've got to be part of someone else's supply chain. They don't have the indigenous capacity, technology, and capital necessary to do it all by themselves. And in a world that's moving into a tighter labor market, if you're not going to relocate the labor, you're talking about using some degree of automation to help out. Some places can do that, some places can't. But it's difficult for me to see kind of a neo-colonial manufacturing system set up to tap unskilled labor on a different continent, especially a continent that is as riven geographically as Africa, so the basic transport issues are very, very difficult. It would be cheaper to do more automation in a closer economy. So in the case of Germany, that's probably going to be Poland. In the case of the United States, that's probably going to be Mexico and Colombia. In the case of China, that would probably be Southeast Asia. I'm not overly concerned about automation being a giant job destroyer. Remember, the Zoomers are the ones who are coming in, the smallest generation we've ever had, and they're not millennials, they're not social, they're antisocial, and they're very loyal workers. They're very nervous people because they were raised by Gen X to be told that the future was a dark place where you will have no power, because that's what it has been for us to this point. And because of that, they're very loyal workers. Once they get a job, they cling on to it like their life depends upon it. But they're antisocial. They want to work remotely, preferably in a closet, preferably coding. These are not line jobs. These are not public service jobs. This is a very specific subset. So, if you're in San Jose and you need a bunch of coders, great. Your workforce is covered for the next 20 years. You need them for anything else? Yikes. So we are going to need automation, not just because we have fewer workers, but because the workforce of those fewer workers is very, very different from what we have had for the last 40 years. So we have to have it. On the flip side, automation is one of the most expensive things you can do. It's expensive to develop, to operationalize, to install, and people always forget about this step, the most expensive of all, to keep it updated. That takes capital. We're not going to have as much of that. So this wrestling over what little bits of capital are left is going to be huge.
When you have a system that is as tightly controlled as the Chinese system has been historically and is now, things go one of two directions. Number one, cult of personality means that the buck starts and stops with one dude. And it doesn't matter how smart he is. He's never going to be good enough to manage anything, and certainly not everything, because he can only work through people who are sycophants. Everyone else who is intelligent has been purged from the system a long time ago. And in that sort of environment, once people start to challenge the government in any form, it rapidly spreads to challenging the government and everything. When the fire in Urumqi happened and these protests started, we have already seen the protests expand dramatically to not just be about COVID, but to be about democracy versus dictatorship. And we're seeing Winnie the Pooh holding up blank sheets of paper, which is kind of representation of, you don't really know what you're doing anymore. It's become personal in a week. And if that is allowed to continue, it will spin the entire system apart. And Chinese history is replete with examples of how everything collapses in a matter of weeks and months. This could be one of those. Option two, Xi, one-man show, cult of personality, locks everything down in order to get it all back under political control, in which case any sort of economic dynamism dies very quickly. So neither of these scenarios are good for China as a country or good for China as an economic entity. So many things are going wrong all at the same time. As soon as we got to the end of the Obama years and it was clear that the Americans were done maintaining globalization, first Trump, now Biden, we've always known we were going to get here. And on the China relationship, we've always known we were going to get here, whether it was because of ethics or genocide or jobs or trade security or intellectual property theft or fascism or race, whatever method you want to use to evaluate. We've always known that the bilateral relationship was going to collapse, whether it was going to be because of something on our side, something on their side, something in between. We always known it was going away. And we've always known that China was going to go away. Their demographics are the most terminal on the planet and in history. The birth rate in Shanghai and Beijing are the lowest ever recorded, and they just got revised down another 20% in the last 2 months. We now have a birth rate in China that in the last 6 years has dropped by 70%. And the Chinese are now admitting that they overcounted their population by over 100 million people, and all the missing millions are under age 40. So this was already a country in full demographic collapse that was going to cease to exist this decade.